Look, friends, to the sky, to the stars that dance with this tiny globe on which we travel. Look to the horizon, the tree line, the expanse of wide open fields, to this living, breathing earth that makes our living and breathing possible. Look to the faces that surround you, and notice what a wonder it is that we don't have to walk this world alone. Those words are from a chalice lighting by Reverend Scott Taylor. Awe. There's so much around us that is awesome. And yet, how often do we allow ourselves the luxury of taking it in and experiencing that place of reverence and wonder? Let's take a trip, shall we? Recognize these two characters? Yeah, some of us of a certain age remember the original. Some may not remember the original, but may have seen the movie redo a couple of years ago. That's if you're not familiar with them, that's Mr. Peabody and his buddy, who's the dog, who's the history buff professor turned canine, and his speckled student, Mr. Sherman. And very frequently, what would happen actually on each one of the episodes is that Mr. Peabody would direct Sherman to set the Wayback Machine to a particular place and date in time, and they'd go back and experience augmented history, I'll say. And so what I want to do today to kind of set a little bit of perspective is we're going to set our Wayback Machine to 1871. May 3rd, 1871, to be exact on the date. And we're going to travel back to the port of Boston, Massachusetts, and we're going to greet an immigrant ship that came in on that date in 1871. This is the steamship Samaria, and it's just in from Ireland. Now, Ireland, of course, at that particular time and until 1923, actually, was still part of the United Kingdom in its entirety. And Ireland was at that time still recovering from the extreme poverty and the aftermath of what they refer to as the Great Hunger, the potato famine earlier in the century, about 20 years earlier, that completely devastated Ireland and left much of Ireland in famine and in poverty. And those and other factors drove a very large amount of immigration from Ireland to the United States in that period of between roughly 1840 and 1880. Over 3 million Irish came to this country, and not necessarily always to open arms. But that's a story for yet another day. Today we are coming here to meet one passenger in particular, a 16-year-old young man by the name of Thomas Curley. Now, Tom had come here from the town of Athlone to find a better life. Little information appears on his landing slip other than his age, 16, and his occupation, laborer. And like most immigrants, he traveled here aboard the Samaria in steerage class. Steerage class on these immigrant ships was, well, let's put it this way. If you like to complain about the leg room and the airplane that you fly on, you'd be in heaven on an airplane with a little bit of limited leg room. It was cold. The accommodations were very minimal and very sparse. And sailing across the 10, 12 days that it took to cross the cold April North Atlantic, I'm sure that Tom Curley did not have a particularly wonderful voyage. But we're We're joining him now through the magic of the Wayback Machine as he and 200 and something other steerage passengers make their way off of the Samaria and onto the streets of Lowell, Massachusetts, where, oops, a little early on that one, onto the streets of Lowell, Massachusetts, where he eventually was ultimately employed in the textile mills. Have you ever imagined going back in time? Mm-hmm. Be it in Peabody and Sherman's Wayback Machine or some other method of time warp or time travel, and meeting a famous person, perhaps an Abraham Lincoln or some other famous person in history, or maybe an ancestor in your own life story. And then bringing that person back to this time and place. It's a favorite daydream of mine, and one that I often find myself having. In fact, the reason that I chose Thomas Curley is he happens to have been my great-grandfather. And his namesake son, by the way, was my maternal grandfather, who I know a lot about and was actually a beloved member of my family. But I know very little about my great-grandfather. I know that he came over on the Samaria basically because one of my uncles found this document in some family paperwork. I know that he was married twice. His first wife died. His second wife left him, and alone with my great-aunt Maud and my grandfather. My grandfather grew up at an orphanage. Again, stories for another time. I know very, very little about my great-grandfather himself other than that. But I go there and I sort of bring him back to life as an instrument of perspective. What is the wonder of the world we live in today? Remember that were we to go back to 1871, we'd find ourselves in a very strange environment. So much of what we take for granted today, things we don't even think about, didn't exist. The invention of, now it's time, the electric light bulb. That was almost a decade in the future and far longer before it became practical and something that people had in their own homes. Today we think nothing of flipping on a light switch and filling our rooms full of light. It's something that we do every day. We don't think of it as awesome, but really it is. The 1870s saw the invention of the telephone, of the phonograph, of the movie projector. As rudimentary as those things were, even then, remember there was no electricity. Only the wealthy had central heating. Air conditioning wouldn't be invented for another 30 years. The electric streetcar was in its infancy. The automobile was decades away. So what an absolutely unreal world would ours be to Tom Curley should we put Peabody and Sherman's machine in reverse and bring him back to this place in this time. I started thinking about this a few weeks ago as I sat on an airliner making an approach into Chicago on my way to a business conference in Las Vegas. There I sat on I took that picture out the window of the plane. I sat on a magic carpet, probably about 10,000 feet in the air at that point in time as we're coming in on approach to O'Hare, experiencing something that human beings dreamed about since our ancestors sat in awe watching birds taking flight and wondering what it would be like to fly. We're used to the most incredible things, and were we to go back to 1871 and tell my great-grandfather or his peers about jetliners and computers and the internet, or being able to see somebody and talk to them on the other side of the globe instantaneously with a device that we hold in our hands and keep in our pockets, what would they think? What would they think when we told them that we've been to the moon and actually have walked on the moon? Would they believe it? Could they imagine? Or just the simple idea of looking back from another world and seeing our small blue planet, our little marble that we all live on. And so, as we step out of our time machine and introduce my great-grandfather to the world we live in now, what is it that he would notice first? What sights would catch his eye? What would make him go, wow, and catch his breath in amazement? This, by the way, is the audience participation portion of the sermon today. I'd like you to all use your imaginations for just a moment. You are Tom Curley. You just left 1871, the doors of this machine open, and here you are. What in your daily life would you see that would make you go, wow?
Cell phone.
I'm sorry?
Cell phone.
A cell phone, certainly.
People have their heads down, that they don't look at each other because they're looking at their phones.
Ooh. Yeah, that's pretty awesome. In a not so positive kind of way, that's pretty awesome.
This Christmas tree.
This Christmas, how's so, Angelique?
Well, I mean, if you look at it through the eyes of somebody who would be that, it would be like literal stars are captured on a tree, right?
Uh-huh.
A fake tree.
And it's not even a real tree.
Cars.
Automobiles.
Oh, yeah.
Automobiles.
Riding in one at a supersonic speed.
Think about that. Think about that. So when Tom Curley left the port of Boston, he ultimately ended up in Lowell, where he worked in a textile mill. I do know that about him. I also know he died in an explosion in that textile mill in 1913. But it took how long on horseback, if you think about it, how long would it take on horseback to go the 50 or so miles from Boston to Lowell? You know, it'd take all day. It'd take all day on horseback. And you get into, now it might take all day in a car today, depending on the backup on 495, right? But you know, it's about 45 minutes from Boston to Lowell today. That would be an awesomely amazing thing.
Not that he would see it today, but the supersonic transport.
Yeah, the SST, that's a little faster. I think...
2 years ago, I saw Nepal, the one you showed there.
Yep.
Still burning.
Uh-huh.
It's almost 100 years old.
That's pretty awesome. You think about it. I can't get a light bulb. I can't get one of those old regular light bulbs to last more than about 6 months. Cassandra.
Interracial dating.
Thank you. Thank you. There are things in our society and our culture that just wouldn't have been thought of, right? And we know we've got a long way to go. But out of that perspective, we've come a long way. Diane, I think you had something next.
I'd say the amount of people and the speed at which, not just the cars, but the speed at which that people move.
Yeah, people move much faster today, I'm sure. I get a sense of that when I talk to people even from other parts of the country. Here in the Northeast, we tend to move pretty fast. Lisa.
The music. Because not just the way it sounds, but like the way it's produced. Not necessarily by instruments themselves.
Yeah.
Irishmen in positions of authority and leadership.
There you go. The fact that we had an Irish Catholic president. Because remember, as I sort of alluded to, I'll get you in one second. As I sort of alluded to, the Irish, by the way, in the 1850s and 1860s and 1870s were kind of like the people that some politician that I will not defile this room with, his name, that some politicians like to beat up on. They happen to, in this day and age, they speak Spanish or with Spanish accents, and they come from the other side of the border with Mexico or further south. But that's how Irish people were regarded then, same way, very much the same way. And if you ever read the history of the Know Nothing Party during the 1850s and there was an awful lot of that were directed against specifically the Irish. Donna.
Medical,
Thank you.
transplants,
Yeah.
machines, changing blood, whatever.
How about just like simple medications, vaccines and simple medications like antibiotics? Because Tom Curley's grandson, who would have been my Uncle Norman had he lived, died in 1931 or 32, I think, somewhere around there. He got a cut that got infected, and there was nothing that could be done. He died of sepsis in the 1930s before there were such a thing as antibiotics. So yeah, that's something that we don't even think about, but wow, it's awesome. It's awesome. What else? What else?
I feel wonder at some of the thoughts that I have about things that I saw as a boy and then saw them replaced. Like my father's horses for plowing fields were put aside and they got a new tractor.
All the old ways of doing things like farming that were done with animals, even inside of your lifetime. It's all done with machinery today. Angelique, you had something.
In 1871, diabetes would have been fatal.
Mm-hmm.
And somebody who got it,
Quickly.
a child who got it, would have died within a month at the most.
Right.
And now I carry a machine on me that gives me something that didn't exist at that time, insulin. And I'm able to survive and have survived for 30 years with it.
Right. And
Grocery store.
grocery stores, supermarkets with just about everything imaginable in them, and meat and produce that comes fresh from other parts of the world. What? Citrus fruit at Christmas time in the winter? Huh? You walk through a store today and you see things that when my great-grandfather was here, you would not have seen, not even imaginable, Lisa.
Not just the number of houses, freestanding houses for single families, but how close they are built together.
Yeah. Cassandra. Sports. What do you mean? Because they had sports. My grandfather actually played on a baseball team.
Like
In
the number of sports that we have,
Yeah.
different types of sports.
Yep. Lots of different kinds of sports, right? And the way that they've all become spectator sports on television. Nobody mentioned television.
Broadcast media.
Broadcast media. I was wondering if somebody was going to bring that up, because one of the things that I didn't hear mentioned, and I wondered if I was going to hear it mentioned relatively early on, is radio. The first broadcast radio station went on the air in 1920. Okay? So in 1870. So this is something that we don't even think of anymore. How many of us even turn on a regular radio anymore? Okay, I do too. Yeah, guilty as charged, but I know a lot of people don't. Taken for granted.
GPS.
Oh, GPS. Whoa, you mean there's machines flying up high above the earth and they're somehow or another telling us where we are? Huh? What? Wow.
Another step with diabetes, I have borderline diabetes, and I take a shot to cause my pancreas to produce insulin, so I don't have to
Right.
take it. That's a major step.
Yeah. All those nuances of medical stuff. Right? Lisa?
I'm surprised nobody at this point has mentioned the internet and how fast messages can be transferred.
It's mind-boggling. And that's happened within most of our own young people here. No, that's happened within all of our lifetimes. That's happened within all of our lifetimes. Unbelievable. Angelique.
Along those lines, how many people can read
Uh-huh.
and write?
Yep.
I mean, 1871, it wasn't, I mean, public schools weren't a thing.
Yeah, I can't. I have no idea what the level of education my great-grandfather had. When he came here
And
from,
for that matter,
from
vote.
Ireland.
And along those lines, like women in education, women who are being educated, women getting the right to vote.
So now that we've kind of reviewed all of that, my next question to consider is how many of those things that we were just talking about that our lives are filled with today, that in some cases our lives depend on today. These things that are all around us, and yet we never notice them. We never notice them. Our heads are buried in our cell phone, reading our social media feed, or reading email, or information, or we're watching television, and we're doing all of this stuff, and we're immersed in it, and we don't even think about how incredible it really is. So now we're going to go back in the other direction. We're going to get back into the Wayback Machine. And we're going to return my great-grandfather to 1871. After all, he's still a young man. He was only 16. He was actually 18, but that's another story. He's still a young man, though, and he's got a lot of work to do. But as we step out of the time machine, let's consider what we would find as we stepped out back then and what would fill us with awe. What, when we step back in time and allow ourselves to experience the back then, what would we experience back then that would maybe we hadn't considered that would fill us with awe? Liz?
If you go to a city, I'm not really sure, but I would think it would be dirty. I know when I went to the city when I was a little kid, it was dirty.
Even back to the 1940s, I remember the outhouse, too old.
Uh-huh. So, yeah, that's kind of interesting. This picture's a little newer because you can see there was electric lines, so it's probably turn of the century. But that's East Boston. It's East Boston back at the turn of the last century. So that's one thing we might notice. What else, John?
There might not be any plastic.
Oh, now that would be awesome. That would be totally awesome. No plastic. Wow.
Horses.
Horses. We'd see horses.
Open land.
Open land.
No trees around here.
No trees?
They used all the trees for heating the houses.
Yeah.
Charcoal.
They cut down every tree in Connecticut to make charcoal.
To make
I don't know when
charcoal.
it was.
Diane, you said something. You had something.
I would just be really amazed at the night sky because we'd be able to
Thank
see it
you.
probably everywhere. Even in the city, there wouldn't be that many lights that it would be amazing.
The sky, the clouds, birds winging through the air, stars under the night sky. All of these things that we have available to us still, maybe even better in some ways, without all the trees being cut down. Right? Things that are still available to us that we take for granted, that are all around us, but still existed back then. Stars in the night sky, essentially unchanged from where they were and what they were even back then. We look at them and we see them as they were tens, hundreds, thousands of years ago. Our universe is so vast, and we are such a small part of it, sitting on a small blue planet in the arm of one of the 100 billion galaxies. I thought I had another slide in there. I guess I don't. We take this time to be reminded that we are surrounded by awesome. In the blade of grass, in the sound of the sea lapping up on the shore, the smell of the air, the chill of autumn air, the intricacy of each unique snowflake that falls, if we don't get lost in worrying about shoveling. The light of humanity in the eyes of those around us, the wonder of the fact that we are not alone. We are surrounded by awesome. We, each of us, are awesome. We call ourselves this morning to appreciate the awesome that surrounds us and call ourselves into that appreciation as we begin this month in our spiritual focus of awe. Be in awe. Take a moment, take the time to experience all of the miracles that surround us. Be in awe. So may it be.